Jacob Harrington never imagined that coming home would feel like stepping onto a battlefield all over again. After serving 22 years in the military, with 3 deployments under his belt, he had seen the worst of war. He had endured scorching deserts, freezing mountain ranges, and nights filled with the deafening echoes of artillery. But the wounds he carried weren't just the ones people could see. His right leg was gone below the knee, a sacrifice made in the name of duty, and his left knee barely functioned after years of pushing his body past its limits. On top of that, a spinal injury made prolonged standing an agonizing ordeal. Yet, none of that prepared him for the fight he was about to have in his own neighborhood. When he finally moved back into his suburban home, he quickly realized that the steep steps leading to his front door were an insurmountable obstacle. At first, he tried managing with crutches, then with a temporary ramp made of plywood, but it was unstable and unsafe. Frustrated, he reached out to a group of veteran friends, who all showed up without hesitation to help him build a proper wheelchair ramp, sturdy, functional, and compliant with all accessibility regulations. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about dignity. He had fought for his country, and now he had to fight just to enter his own home without help. For a moment, he thought the battle was won. The ramp was perfect, and it gave him a new sense of freedom. But that feeling didn't last long. A week later, a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, landed on his doorstep, printed on crisp, official-looking stationery. At first, he assumed it was a routine notice, maybe some information about neighborhood meetings or trash collection schedules. Instead, his stomach twisted as he read the words, "Unauthorized structure in violation of community standards. Remove immediately." At first, he thought there had been a mistake. The ramp wasn't some ugly, cobbled-together construction. It was well-built and professionally designed. Surely, they would understand once he explained. But when he called the HOA office, he was met with a wall of indifference. The president, Martha Elridge, was notorious for her rigid enforcement of rules, treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She wasn't interested in Jacob's struggles, his disability, or even the legal protections that should have made this issue non-negotiable. "Rules are rules," she said with a smug finality. He could almost hear the satisfaction in her voice. Jacob refused to back down, so Martha escalated. Within days, he received another letter, this time a formal notice of violation, complete with a $150,000 fine and a threat of legal action if he didn't comply. It was ludicrous. It was an attack on his rights, his dignity, and his ability to live independently. His ramp wasn't hurting anyone. In fact, some of his neighbors had already complimented him on how well it blended with the house. But Martha had power, and she wielded it like a weapon. He tried reasoning with her, offering to adjust the design, paint it to match the house, or even plant shrubs around it to make it more aesthetic. But nothing swayed her. "The rules exist for a reason," she repeated, a phrase that began to sound more like a personal vendetta than an actual policy. Jacob's frustration turned into fury. He had fought in wars, survived explosions, and endured months in a hospital learning to walk again, only to return home and be treated like a second-class citizen in his own neighborhood. The betrayal burned deep. He had given everything for his country, and now a group of bureaucratic busybodies were telling him he couldn't even modify his own home to accommodate his injuries. What made it worse was that he knew, deep down, this wouldn't be happening if he were anyone else. He had seen exceptions made for others, gazebos, fancy decks, even a massive treehouse someone had built for their kids. But a wheelchair ramp? That was somehow unacceptable. Word spread fast, and soon the entire community knew about the lawsuit. Some of his neighbors rallied behind him, appalled by the HOA's cruelty, while others murmured behind closed doors, suggesting he should have followed the proper process before building anything. The most infuriating part was that even if he had sought permission, the HOA likely would have denied him from the start. That was their game. Deny, delay, then destroy any opposition. But they had picked the wrong man to intimidate. He wasn't going to remove the ramp. He wasn't going to give in. If Martha and the HOA wanted to fight, then they had just declared war on a man who had spent his life winning them. Jacob sat at his kitchen table, the HOA's latest letter clenched in his prosthetic hand. He had reread it so many times the words had begun to blur together. $150,000 in fines. Immediate removal of the wheelchair ramp. Non-compliance will result in further legal action. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but there was nothing funny about being forced to fight for something as basic as getting into his own home. His phone buzzed. It was another neighbor checking in, offering support. Ever since word had spread about the lawsuit, the community had fractured into two camps. On one side were the people who saw the HOA's actions for what they were: heartless, bureaucratic nonsense fueled by power-hungry individuals with too much control. On the other side were the rule followers, the ones who muttered, "He should have asked permission first," or "rules exist for a reason," as if common sense didn't apply in this situation. Some of them weren't even cruel, just so conditioned to accept authority that they couldn't fathom standing up to it. That frustrated Jacob more than anything. It was one thing to have enemies. It was another to have people who agreed with you, but were too afraid to speak out. The HOA wasted no time justifying their actions. A formal statement was sent to all residents, filled with cold legal jargon that made it sound like Jacob had committed some grave offense. While we understand the challenges faced by our residents, the HOA exists to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. Unauthorized structures negatively impact property values and must be addressed accordingly. It was laughable. A wheelchair ramp, a necessary accommodation for a disabled veteran, was being equated to an eyesore. But the HOA wasn't just defending their stance, they were actively trying to turn the community against him. Flyers were circulated, emails sent, and soon, whispers turned into open discussions about what kind of precedent Jacob's defiance would set. If we let this slide, what's next? Someone building a shed without permission? Painting their house neon green? The fear-mongering was as predictable as it was infuriating. Jacob wasn't the type to seek attention, but suddenly his battle had become public. Local news stations picked up the story, spinning it into a David versus Goliath tale of a wounded war hero against a tyrannical HOA. The first time a reporter knocked on his door, he nearly shut it in their face. He didn't want to be a spectacle. He just wanted to live his life. But then he thought about the veterans who would come after him, the ones who might be in the same position but with fewer resources, less support, and no way to fight back. He gave his first interview reluctantly, but once the cameras rolled, his military discipline took over. "I didn't fight for this country so I could come home and be told I don't have the right to enter my own house," he said, his voice steady, his expression unwavering. "This isn't just about me. It's about anyone who has ever been told they don't belong because they don't fit into some arbitrary standard." The response was immediate. The video went viral, shared across veteran forums, disability advocacy groups, and social media pages filled with furious comments demanding justice. People who had never met Jacob before were calling him a hero all over again. The backlash against the HOA was swift, but they were prepared for it. Instead of backing down, they doubled down. A new letter arrived, more aggressive than the last. Public sentiment does not override legal agreements. Your home is part of a deed-restricted community, and you agreed to abide by HOA guidelines upon purchase. Your noncompliance threatens the legal standing of our policies. It was a power play. They wanted to make an example out of him to show that no amount of media pressure or public outcry could bend their rules. And yet, Jacob noticed something interesting. The tone had shifted. They weren't just threatening him anymore. They were scared. The community was shifting too. Neighbors who had once stayed silent were now openly debating at HOA meetings, questioning why a man who had sacrificed so much for his country was being treated like an outsider in his own neighborhood. Some residents even began breaking small rules in protest, tiny acts of defiance, like leaving garbage bins out too long or putting up unapproved decorations. It wasn't much, but it was something. And then something unexpected happened. An anonymous source leaked internal HOA emails to the press. The emails were damning. They revealed private conversations between HOA board members, including one from Martha Elridge herself. If we let this man get away with it, we lose control. I don't care if he's a veteran. The rules apply to everyone, and we need to make an example of him. Another board member had responded, "Are we sure we want to take this to court? This could backfire." But Martha's response was chilling. "We have the money. He doesn't. He'll break before we do." When Jacob read those words, something inside him hardened. He had faced men like this before. People who thought power was the same thing as justice. People who mistook wealth for strength. They had just made the worst mistake possible. They had underestimated him. Jacob had been through wars, but nothing prepared him for the slow, grinding brutality of a legal battle against a system designed to exhaust him. The HOA had drawn first blood by filing their lawsuit, officially demanding that he remove the ramp immediately or pay $150,000 in accumulated fines and legal penalties. He had known it was coming, but seeing it in writing, printed in cold, official lettering, sent a chill down his spine. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the summons, trying to process what it meant. Fighting back wasn't just a matter of principle anymore. It was survival. If he lost, he wouldn't just owe an absurd fine. He could lose his home. The HOA's strategy was clear: drown him in legal fees, outlast him, force him into submission. They thought he'd fold. They thought he'd break under the pressure. But they didn't understand something fundamental about him. Jacob Harrington didn't lose. The first thing he did was call his lawyer, a no-nonsense former Marine named Greg Hollis, who had handled veterans' rights cases before. The moment Greg read through the lawsuit, he whistled low. "They're not just trying to win," he muttered. "They're trying to make an example out of you." Jacob had already figured that much out. What he hadn't expected was the sheer volume of legal maneuvers the HOA would throw at him. Every week, there was a new motion, a new request, a new attempt to delay the trial and drain his resources. Martha Elridge and her board weren't just playing defense. They were attacking, filing injunctions, demanding depositions, trying to dig up anything in his past that could be used against him. They even questioned whether he really needed the wheelchair ramp, citing pictures of him standing during interviews. That infuriated Jacob more than anything. He had worked for years in rehab to stand on his prosthetic leg for short periods. Did they think that meant he could just walk up the stairs like everyone else? Did they even understand what it took to live with these injuries? Meanwhile, the court date loomed closer, and the stress started to take its toll. Jacob had spent his life training his mind to be sharp under pressure, but this wasn't a battlefield where he could rely on instinct and reflexes. This was a slow war of attrition, and the worst part was how deeply it invaded his personal life. Sleep became elusive, eaten away by late-night legal calls and the gnawing uncertainty of what might happen if he lost. His savings were already taking a hit. The HOA had millions in reserve, but he was one man fighting on his own dime. The donations from supporters helped, but he refused to let the public bankroll his fight completely. He had always been self-sufficient, and the thought of relying on others, no matter how well-meaning, felt like another blow to his pride. But pride wasn't the only thing he was losing. His health was suffering too. The stress made his phantom limb pain worse, sent migraines pounding through his skull, and left his nerves on edge in a way he hadn't felt since his last deployment. The HOA, of course, saw his struggles as weakness. They escalated their attacks, pushing for an emergency ruling that would force him to tear the ramp down before the trial even started. That was when Greg went on the offensive. "They're banking on the judge seeing this as a simple zoning dispute," he told Jacob. "We need to make them see the truth. This isn't about aesthetics. It's about civil rights." Greg filed a counterclaim, arguing that the HOA was violating federal disability laws and actively discriminating against a wounded veteran. That was the moment the case stopped being just about Jacob. It became national news. Veterans groups started organizing protests outside the HOA office, and disability activists flooded social media with support. "HOA bullies disabled veteran over wheelchair ramp" became the dominant headline on news sites, and once the story hit cable news, it spiraled into something much bigger. Senators started weighing in. Advocacy organizations began pressuring lawmakers. Even a high-profile civil rights attorney reached out, offering to assist in an appeal if the case didn't go Jacob's way. The pressure on the HOA skyrocketed, but they still refused to back down. Martha Elridge wasn't just fighting to enforce the rules. She was fighting to keep her power. If she lost to Jacob, she lost control over the entire neighborhood. If people saw that her rules weren't absolute, it would open the floodgates. And she couldn't allow that. The final blow before trial came when a whistleblower from the HOA board came forward. An anonymous source leaked a recorded meeting where Martha was caught saying, "I don't care what the law says. He's turning this neighborhood into a charity case. If we let him have his ramp, next thing you know, we'll have homeless people setting up tents. We have standards to maintain." That recording was damning. It proved what Jacob already knew. This wasn't about a rule. It was about control. It was about a power-hungry woman who thought she could dictate who did and didn't belong in her pristine little community. It was about pushing out people who didn't fit the mold of what she thought a perfect resident should be. When the recording went public, it tipped the scales. The HOA's legal team scrambled to distance themselves from Martha, but it was too late. The damage was done. The case wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was a referendum on who deserved dignity and who got to decide the rules of society. And as the court date arrived, Jacob realized something important. This was the biggest battle he had ever fought. Not for his life, not for his country, but for his right to exist in the very home he had fought to protect. Jacob knew he was winning the public battle, but he also knew that public opinion didn't always translate into courtroom victories. He had seen too many injustices swept under the rug to believe that media outrage alone would guarantee justice. The HOA had money, lawyers, and decades of experience manipulating rules to suit their needs. The leaked recording had been a devastating blow, but Martha Elridge wasn't giving up. Instead, she pivoted. The HOA released a new statement, painting themselves as the real victims. It is unfortunate that private neighborhood matters have been blown out of proportion by the media. This lawsuit is not about discrimination, but about preserving the integrity of our community. While we deeply respect Mr. Harrington's service, we must also uphold the standards that every homeowner agreed to upon purchasing their property. It was a classic move: deflect, reframe, and play the victim. But it didn't stop there. The HOA's lawyers started digging deeper into Jacob's past, looking for anything they could use against him. They scrutinized his military records, his financial history, even old emails and social media posts. The goal was clear: discredit him. If they couldn't win on legal grounds, they would try to destroy his reputation. And just when Jacob thought he was prepared for anything, something happened that caught him completely off guard. A knock on his door in the middle of the night. Not a reporter, not another supporter, a man he had never seen before. Middle-aged, dressed in a faded work jacket, nervous but determined. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About the HOA. about things you don't know. Jacob let him in cautiously, sizing him up. The man introduced himself as Tom Reynolds, a former member of the HOA board who had resigned 2 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Tom wasn't just another angry neighbor, he had been on the inside. And what he told Jacob changed everything. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. They were running a full-scale financial scam. According to Tom, Martha Elridge and her inner circle had been using HOA fees to funnel money into private accounts. Under the guise of neighborhood improvement projects, they had been overcharging residents for everything from landscaping to security services, then skimming off the top. Tom had discovered it when he was still on the board, but when he confronted Martha, she shut him down. If you want to keep your house, you'll keep your mouth shut. He had quit shortly after, but the guilt had never left him. And now, seeing how they were targeting Jacob, he couldn't stay silent anymore. But the biggest bombshell was still to come. Tom revealed that the fight over Jacob's ramp wasn't random. It was strategic. The lawsuit had never been about a wheelchair ramp. It was about distraction. They've been embezzling for years, Tom explained, pulling out a thick folder. But if people are focused on you, they won't be looking at the real crime. Jacob felt his pulse quicken as he flipped through the documents. Falsified invoices, contracts with fake companies, suspicious bank transfers. This wasn't just corruption. This was criminal. Martha had gone after him so aggressively because she needed a big fight to keep the community occupied. If they could drag this out, keep the neighborhood divided, keep the media focused on Jacob's case, no one would be looking too closely at where the HOA's money was actually going. And if they could crush him, bankrupt him, set a precedent that no homeowner could challenge their authority, they would have absolute power over the neighborhood. Jacob sat back, exhaling slowly. He had spent his entire career identifying enemy tactics, and now the full scope of Martha's plan was clear. This wasn't just about a ramp anymore. It was about exposing something much bigger. He looked at Tom, then at the files. "Are you willing to testify?" Tom hesitated. Martha doesn't just control the HOA. She has connections, real estate developers, local officials. If I go public, I could lose everything. Jacob knew that fear well. He had seen men hesitate on the battlefield, knowing that stepping forward meant putting a target on their back. But he also knew something else. Doing nothing was worse. "I'll stand with you," Jacob promised. "But we take this all the way." With Tom's evidence, the fight had changed. Jacob wasn't just defending his ramp anymore. He was taking down an empire. Jacob sat in the courthouse, his hands folded tightly on the table in front of him, his lawyer Greg beside him. The room buzzed with tension. On the opposite side sat Martha Elridge, her face an impenetrable mask of arrogance, flanked by a small army of HOA attorneys in pristine suits. They looked confident. Too confident. They thought they had already won. But they had no idea what was coming. The judge, an older woman with a sharp gaze, called the court to order. The HOA's lead attorney wasted no time in making their case. He painted Jacob as a rule breaker, someone who had disregarded community guidelines and forced the HOA into an unfortunate but necessary lawsuit. "This case is not about discrimination or targeting a veteran," the lawyer droned. "It is about the integrity of our neighborhood, about ensuring that the agreed-upon rules are upheld. Mr. Harrington's ramp, while understandable, sets a dangerous precedent." Jacob clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain still. Dangerous precedent? Since when was basic accessibility a danger? Then came the personal attacks. The HOA tried to argue that Jacob's mobility wasn't as bad as he claimed, citing pictures of him standing at interviews. They questioned his finances, implying that he had allowed the lawsuit to escalate for attention and donations. They even accused him of using his veteran status as a shield to deflect from the fact that he had, in their words, blatantly disregarded community guidelines. It was cruel, calculated, and exactly what Jacob had expected. But they weren't the only ones prepared. Greg rose, his voice even but razor sharp. "This is a case of discrimination, hiding behind a policy manual," he said. "The HOA is not simply enforcing neighborhood rules. They are weaponizing them to target a disabled veteran." Then, piece by piece, he dismantled their argument. First, he pulled out the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, and proved that federal law overruled HOA guidelines. He cited legal precedents where HOAs had been sued for similar cases and lost. He highlighted how the HOA had previously made exceptions for other homeowners who built unapproved structures but had chosen to make Jacob their scapegoat. Then he dropped the bombshell. "Your Honor, we have evidence that this lawsuit was never about a ramp. It was a smokescreen to cover up financial crimes committed by the HOA's leadership." The courtroom erupted. Greg laid out the leaked emails, the fraudulent invoices, the bank transfers. Then he called Tom Reynolds to the stand. The former HOA board member, pale but determined, testified under oath that Martha Elridge had been stealing from the HOA for years. He detailed how she funneled money through fake contracts, how she bullied board members into silence, and how she orchestrated the attack on Jacob to distract the community from her own crimes. Martha's face turned rigid. Her attorneys scrambled, whispering frantically, but the damage was done. Then Greg delivered the final blow. "And let's not forget," he said, voice ringing through the courtroom, "that Ms. Elridge was caught on tape saying, 'I don't care what the law says. If we let him have his ramp, next thing you know, we'll have homeless people setting up tents.'" Gasps filled the room. Martha's lawyers objected, demanded the recording be stricken from the record, but the judge allowed it. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And then came the public response. Jacob had expected some support, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. Hundreds of veterans arrived outside the courthouse, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes, others simply standing in solidarity. Signs waved in air. "We fought for our rights. Now we fight for his, and shame on the OA." The media captured every moment. News channels played the leaked recordings on repeat. Social media exploded with outrage. Celebrities started weighing in. A GoFundMe that had been quietly set up for Jacob's legal fees skyrocketed past $500,000 in donations within hours. The pressure was relentless. And Martha Elridge was finished. By the end of the trial, the judge ruled in Jacob's favor. Not only did she declare the HOA's fines and lawsuit void, but she also ordered a full investigation into financial misconduct. The HOA's lawyers tried to appeal, but it was over. As Jacob walked out of the courtroom, his ramp intact, his dignity unshaken, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Strangers shook his hand, veterans saluted him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly victorious. But he had no idea that the biggest twist was still coming. Jacob stood at the courthouse steps, the weight of months of battle slowly lifting from his shoulders as the cheers of the crowd echoed around him. He should have felt victorious. In many ways, he was. He had stood his ground, fought the system, and won. The judge had ruled in his favor, dismissing the absurd $150,000 fine and declaring his wheelchair ramp legal, permanent, and untouchable. The HOA was forced to back down, their credibility in ruins, their so-called authority shattered under the weight of their own corruption. But even as the cameras flashed and reporters shoved microphones in his face, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not yet. Inside the courthouse, the fallout was just beginning. The judge had ordered an immediate forensic audit of the HOA's finances, and what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Martha Elridge hadn't just been skimming off the top, She had embezzled over $2.3 million in HOA funds over the past decade. Fake contracts, inflated service fees, phony maintenance projects. It was all there in black and white. The homeowners who had been blindly paying their dues for years suddenly realized they had been financing Martha's extravagant lifestyle, her luxury vacations, private investments, even a secret second home in Florida. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Residents who had once blindly defended the HOA were now furious. The same people who had whispered that Jacob should have followed the rules were now demanding refunds, resignations, and criminal charges. HOA board members who had stood beside Martha scrambled to distance themselves, but the evidence was damning. And when investigators dug deeper, they found another bombshell. Martha hadn't just been targeting Jacob, she had done this before. Several years ago, a young couple in the neighborhood had tried to install a wheelchair ramp for their child, who had a severe neuromuscular disorder. They had followed every HOA rule, filed all the paperwork, and yet they were denied. Martha had buried them in so many regulations and additional fees that they had been forced to sell their home and move. At the time, no one had questioned it. But now, with her corruption exposed, everything clicked into place. This was never about a wheelchair ramp. It was about control, about power, about greed. Jacob watched as Martha was handcuffed and escorted out of the courthouse, her carefully composed mask of superiority finally cracking. The cameras swarmed her, reporters yelling questions she refused to answer. She had spent years ruling the neighborhood like a queen, but now she was just another criminal. The HOA was immediately dismantled, placed under legal oversight, and the homeowners voted overwhelmingly to dissolve it completely. Jacob could finally breathe. The fight was over. Or so he thought. The twist that no one saw coming. A week later, Jacob was sitting in his backyard, Nike, his loyal service dog, resting at his feet when a car pulled up to his driveway. He didn't recognize it. The engine shut off, and after a long moment, Tom Reynolds stepped out, the former HOA board member who had blown the whistle. Jacob tensed slightly. Tom had already done his part. What else was there to say? Tom looked uneasy, gripping an envelope in his hands. He cleared his throat. "There's something you need to know," he said. Jacob raised an eyebrow, but gestured for him to sit. Tom hesitated, then handed him the envelope. This was buried in the HOA's records. "It's about your house." Jacob frowned, opening the envelope and scanning the documents inside. At first, it didn't make sense. Just a standard deed transfer, some legal forms, and then he saw it. His house wasn't originally supposed to be his. The paperwork revealed that the HOA had originally blocked his home purchase. When Jacob had bought the house after returning from service, he had assumed everything had gone smoothly. But behind the scenes, Martha had fought to deny his application. Why? Because, as the document showed, she had already promised the property to a real estate developer friend who planned to flip it for profit. The only reason the sale had gone through was because of a legal technicality. By the time Martha realized she couldn't stop it, the deal had already closed. Jacob felt his blood run cold. She had been after him from the beginning. The lawsuit, the ramp, the harassment, it hadn't been about the rules. It had been personal. Martha had wanted him gone from the moment he arrived, and when she couldn't get rid of him through legal loopholes, she had tried to break him financially. Jacob let out a slow breath, gripping the papers a little tighter. Tom shifted uncomfortably. "I thought you should know," he said. "She never planned to let you stay here." Jacob exhaled, his pulse steadying. He should have been furious. He should have felt the sting of betrayal all over again. But instead, he just felt done. Martha had lost. He was still here, and she wasn't. And that was all the victory he needed. He looked back at Tom and nodded. "Thanks for telling me." Tom gave a small nod, then stood. "You ever need anything, you know where to find me." Jacob watched as he walked back to his car and drove away, disappearing into the distance. He sat there for a long time, the document still in his hand. Then, finally, he smiled. Martha had tried to erase him, to push him out, but he was still standing, and he wasn't going anywhere. The case became a national turning point in HOA reform. Lawmakers introduced new legislation protecting disabled homeowners from similar discrimination. More people came forward with stories of HOA abuse, demanding accountability. And Jacob, despite the attention, quietly returned to his life. His ramp still standing, his dignity intact. When a reporter asked him how he felt about it all, he just chuckled and said, "I didn't need a war, but if you start one with me, you better be ready to lose." And that was the end of it. Or maybe it was just the beginning.